Today on Locked On Red Wings, who on Detroit's roster is the easiest to trade away? And is it time to reassess the NHL's point system?
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. I am a former podcast producer for WWJ and broadcast producer for 97.1 The Ticket. Well, Scotty is the host over at Locked On Tigers, as well as a freelance journalist for the Detroit News. And today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. And you got to admit it, we all have a little bit of a competitive side to us. And if you're a big fan of Monopoly, you'll be an even bigger fan of Monopoly Go, which is a classic twist on the classic game. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Scotty, today we're going to kind of continue to reassess and look at the Red Wings roster from this past season and talk about not necessarily what holes need to be filled, but what holes we can create to be filled in this episode. Talking about guys who, I don't want to call them like dead weight or anything. That's certainly NHL caliber players, but guys I feel hold a position that the Red Wings, if they can move on from that player, can then upgrade in at that spot. We're not going to talk about how to upgrade it this episode, but just mostly talking about who and why I think could be candidates to trade away off this roster to clear some cap space, as you're going to be signing and acclimating a bunch of your cap to two big signings this year. And then maybe upgrade in a different way somehow later on in a different episode. But we're going to talk about that. And then obviously, as you can see on the show sheet, if you're watching us on YouTube, time to talk a little bit about the NHL's point system. Red Wings missed the playoffs despite having more wins than two of the teams that made it in. We won't be blaming the point system. We're not that naive. The Red Wings had every opportunity to make the playoffs, but we do want to talk about it because it is interesting. It is an interesting conversation. So, Scotty, without further ado, let's just hit the road running. I hope you're having a great Thursday, by the way, buddy. I haven't even said hi to you yet. Hi.
Hey, what's up, man?
Not much, just here. Just recording.
I'm getting ready for the draft. I'll be going to the draft tonight. It'll be fun.
Scotty, let's not beat around the bush here. There is pretty much one guy that is on the top of everyone's list of candidates to be traded away, or even for this gentleman to be bought out. And we've talked about him before, so it's not going to come to surprise to return listeners when I say this name, and that is Justin Holl. Justin Holl is probably candidate number 1, 2, and 3 for trading away to create a roster spot and then just even give him an opportunity to play somewhere that's going to play him. So, I mean, when it comes to Justin Holl, man, what are the benefits to trading away this guy, right? Like it's an endless list, it seems.
Yeah. I think that this guy is probably, like you said, at the top of most people's lists. The most difficult conversation or the biggest hurdle that is going to be jumped with trading Holl is just simply how much money do you have to eat to get a trade done? That is really the only question and the only thing that is going to be negotiated and debated back and forth between this front office and somebody if they can get a deal done. And there's a chance that it's like not even a thing, that's like not even really on the table. But I think that's something the Wings absolutely explore. And yeah, it's really just going to come down to how much money are the Wings willing to eat of this remaining contract.
Yeah, and it gets a little bit tougher too when you're talking to potential takers on Justin Holl, that he has a 10-team modified no trade list, right? Yeah. So you're going to have to also cater a little bit to his wants and his needs. As on top of the fact that he makes $3.4 million for a guy who played just 38 games this past year. Now, it is of note that the year prior, he played 80 games with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and was a huge part of their defensive core. Now, you could argue whether or not that's out of necessity because their D-core has always historically been pretty bad. But like, this is a guy who's capable of playing big minutes at the NHL level but he could not find his way into the roster with the Red Wings. And if you're going to trade him away, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that you're going to probably be giving up more than you're getting. And that's just the consequence. The biggest thing you're going to be getting by trading him away is potential cap space and just a roster spot in general, because it doesn't benefit the Red Wings to have $3.4 million for the next 2 years tied up in a guy who potentially will be a healthy scratch again next season, much like he was this season. And it doesn't benefit Justin Holl, who I would imagine, as much as he's fine getting paid $3.4 million to not play, I bet you he's got quite the competitive edge in him and wants to get into the lineup. And him not playing hockey, which is his livelihood and will then lead to his next contract, probably not super happy about the idea of not playing when this is what he loves to do. So it would benefit both teams to move on, but I'm just warning the people that any return you would get for Justin Holl, the biggest thing you'd be getting back is roster space. And if you're going to be trading away Justin Holl, it would probably, I would assume, be at 50% retained. And you might even have to give a draft pick, right? Think about, for example, Mark Stahl, Scotty. When they acquired Mark Stahl a couple years ago, we talked about how this is great for the Red Wings because they are a rebuilding team. This brings veteran leadership. He might still have a little bit left in the tank, and you're getting him at 50% retained and even get a draft pick back in return. It's a cap dump thing. The biggest thing you get out of trades like this is freeing up cap space. And so you might have to give up a 6th or 7th rounder, or maybe even like a 5th rounder, to get rid of Hall and 50% of his contract just to get that extra $1.5 million cap space. And that's the reality of it. The most likely teams to take a guy like Justin Holl are probably going to be teams that are rebuilding, like a San Jose Sharks, who could use a guy who can and is capable of playing big minutes, while they're a team that's trying to get better. Because let's face it, Justin Holl is probably actually an upgrade on their blue line, given the construction of that roster. Like, these are all things to keep in mind when we talk about trading away a guy is, what's the fit and what are you going to have to do to get rid of him?
Right, exactly. And I think the market for him is going to be completely determined by how much money the Wings are okay with eating in a potential trade. So yeah, obviously he's a guy, he's going to be the first person that comes up when this fan base has this conversation, but it's just going to come down to money.
Yeah, it is. And the other reality too is if you can't find a trade partner, buyout is another
for sure
healthy candidate.
And that, again, comes down to money.
Well, yeah. So if you trade away, that's why I'm such a big. I would rather send away a draft pick and retain 50% to get rid of Justin Holl, just simply because then you're only paying him 50% for the next 2 years. If you buy him out, it doubles the remaining length of his contract and halves the amount you have to pay him. So you'll be paying him 50%, but instead of for the next 2 years, like you would be doing if you traded him, it'd be for the next 4 years, which maybe isn't like the worst case scenario for this year and the next, but as 3 and 4 that buyout go on, that million, 1.5 or whatever it would be is going to matter more and more. So
yeah,
that's candidate number one. Scotty, we got an extra minute here before we go to break, and we can at least start the conversation about another guy. I think a lot of our conversations on this episode are going to be from the blue line, because that's where you and I agree we want the most overhaul, even if it likely isn't going to happen. But I think Olli Maatta is actually another candidate to be traded away. This is a guy I wasn't super. When they extended him, I'm like, okay, he's having a really good year in a third pair role, taking pretty easy competition, but he's been effective. He's been effective in that role on the third pair. But my biggest question mark then, and is still now, is the future. And especially with this year coming up, when we're expecting Edvinsson and Albert Johansson to be full-time, and both of those guys are left side D, natural. Obviously, Albert can play right side if he has to, but they're both natty lefts. Where does a guy like Olli Maatta fit into that? And I don't know if he does. And he has one more year left on his contract. He has no trade clause, no trade clause whatsoever. He just has $3 more million on his deal. That's it. I think he's a lot easier to be moved, even if you do still have to retain a little bit. But I don't even know if you would have to for an Olli Maatta, because he has been effective. But it just comes down to roster crunch. And I think that he is a replaceable player because he plays such a niche role. He doesn't play a lot of special teams. He's just a good shutdown third pair defenseman. But let's be honest, on a really good team, he'd probably just be a 7th D man.
Yeah, no, I think that he is also, now that this past season is over, anyone that would be acquiring him, he is a rental. He's a 1-year, you know what I mean? He's a 1-year rental type of player. And those are, you're not going to get much, right? You're not going to get much for a third pair rental making $3 million, but I don't think that you'd have to retain a lot, if any at all, to move that either. Yeah, I think that the trade of Olli Maatta will come down to their ability to move on from Holl or even Petry, if we want to have that conversation too. I think that if the Wings can't find legitimate trade partners for either of those guys, that because you're already losing Ghost, presumably. So like you're already going to have one spot free up. So you don't necessarily need to dump like half of this blue line, but you also can if you want to. And I think that I think that it's really Olli Maatta's standing on the team is really going to come down to like if they have the ability to or do, move on from Ghost, Holl, and potentially Petry, then like they'd probably hold on to Olli Maatta. But if they're having trouble with two of those three, then maybe he becomes a candidate for sure.
Right. The problem isn't like Olli Maatta, like I said, is very effective in his role.
Right.
But the problem is his role is so limited. And part of that I think is because of the player he was playing with, right? He was paired up with Shane Gostisbehere, and because of how Gostisbehere plays, they only got offensive zone deployments. They played against the weakest competition and got the fewest minutes out of anyone on the team. And he was, again, effective in that role. But going down the line, you want to be able to put your third pair. I'm not saying like Moritz, Seider-esque, but you want to be able to give them a slightly tougher competition. You want the whole roster to get better. I think the best thing for this roster is to either move on from Olli Maatta on the left side so you can bring in your Albert Johansson, your Simon Edvinsson, because remember, Wollman's going to be healthy next year, so you have him back in the lineup. Or Wollman is your 7th or 8th D-man who you can dependably have come in and play every 2nd, 3rd, 4th game to give a guy a rest. That's the best case scenario because the blue line is just packed and something's got to give.
Yeah.
We're going to go to a quick break. When we return, we'll talk about, you actually name dropped them there in segment 1. We'll talk about that gentleman as well as one other guy on our list before talking about the point systems in segment 3. So stay tuned to Locked On Red Wings. I've been told, Scotty, I'm a pretty competitive person. Do you think that's true?
I do.
Oh, I am.
You're Brian the Enforcer.
Brian the Enforcer. Mr. Shoulder pops out all willy-nilly. Yeah, we all have a little bit of competitive side, myself included. It's why I've played hockey my entire life and why I love the sport. And my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's been downloaded over 150 million times. It's a great twist on Monopoly where you play on not one, but on hundreds of Monopoly board games in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. But the best part is messing with my friends. I can charge them rent on my iconic properties, just like in classic Monopoly, but now I can also heist their vaults of riches for myself. I love stealing from my friends. So fun. And the leaderboards show me who the biggest Monopoly tycoon is. And of course, it's me. Let's not. One thing I can be good at, and it's Monopoly. But it's not just my competitive side that loves it. You can team up with friends and people all around the world in timed tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now, free on the App Store or Google Play. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty, I'm going to let you take this one away because you mentioned it in segment 1, but that would be Jeff Petry. And I swear I'm not doing this to be mean, but this is probably the most complicated one. You just name dropped him, so I wanted you to be able to carry the torch. Yeah,
well, the reason why it's interesting for a lot of reasons. One is because he is also now a rental, right? This upcoming season is the last year on his deal, but I also feel like he may be one of like sneakily the most movable just because of all of the money that has been like retained and deferred, and like he's getting paid from like 8 different organizations. It feels like every 2 weeks. So the Wings are only on the hook for 2.3 mil this upcoming year, and I think that is, he certainly has his flaws, and we had our frustrations with Jeff Petry, but there are plenty of teams that I think would be willing to have 1 year of Jeff Petry in their bottom four for less than $2.5 million.
Not even bottom four, bottom pair, just straight up bottom
Yeah,
pair.
yeah. Sure. Well, yeah, I was going, depend on the team he goes to was my
That's true.
thought, but
Fair,
sure.
fair point. Fair point.
And so I think that I think that he is a guy who is, again, like, not as much of a hot button as Justin Holl would be in this conversation, but a guy that is movable just because it's not long term, it's not that much money, and for all of the flaws that he has, proved that like he's not just like he's not over the hill, like, oh, like, needs to retire immediately type of thing. He can play, to your point, probably third line somewhere if need be. Now, the question becomes, how much of a market does that really, like, how much of a market does that type of profile really have? And I'm not sure that's a very big market. So I think that's probably the biggest hurdle you have to overcome with that one, is just like how many people, I don't know, how many teams are really chomping at the bit to add a 36 next year, 37-year-old Jeff Petry with 1 year left. But as far as the contract goes, it is movable. So it's kind of a give and take conversation.
And so here's the weirdest part, right? And this is I'm gonna fire up the fan base with this comment, Scotty. I actually don't mind holding on to Jeff Petry for his last year of his contract. I know that a lot of people, and ourselves included, railed against Jeff Petry down the stretch. But I think a lot of that has to do with over deployment. I think a lot of that has to do with out of necessity. He is a third pair defenseman. And we saw when paired with Simon Edvinsson, and they got, because they did, when Simon Edvinsson joined the team, it is factual. You can look it up game by game. They got less difficult deployments than when Sherratt and Petry were together. So when slightly better deployments and a really big, tall, young player on his other side, they were a much more effective defensive pair. And I think Jeff Petry on the third pair on the right side, because again, it's hard to upgrade the right side. It really is. Could be an effective D-man, even more effective if he is a seventh D-man. Now, of course, I was just said the same thing about Olli Maatta. You can only have so many seventh D-men. But I wouldn't mind Jeff Petry on this team solely because right side is such a huge need in the NHL. He does play it, and he can play. He played quite a bit of penalty kill time as well. On the third pair, I wouldn't mind Jeff Petry still. I think a lot of our frustration with him this season was over deployment, and part of that is roster construction, part of that is coaching, and part of that is just his own age. Like, it was a mix of a lot of different factors. But at the same time, Scotty, you are right? Like, right now, we're paying him how much? 2.5? 2.3, because two teams have previously retained his contract. He's got 1 year left. He's got a 15-team no trade clause, which is going to make it a little bit harder to move him if you want. I'm not against moving him. If they found a way to trade him, I'd be like, okay, cool. Like, now we can get younger on the blue line. But I'm just thinking about, if you're going to move on from Holl and you're looking at the right side free agent market, and there's not a ton out there because right side is really hard across the league, hard to come by. There's just not a lot of right side defensemen in the NHL, right-handed players in the NHL. Like, the percentage is almost is, I don't know the actual percentage, but it's over 50% left-handed players. So I would not mind him in a third pair role. Anything higher than that, you're going to see the same issue and frustration that we all had this past year. But I wouldn't mind holding on to him, but I'm definitely not against trading him. But I think it also, and see, some people may roll their eyes at this, and maybe this is just the sentimental part of me here. But I think the fact that he basically forced his way here because he wanted to play him is going to make it harder to move him. And I mean that from a standpoint of, like, you don't, and I could be completely off base, and I completely admit that. I don't know how the ongoings of front office works, right? Like, I'm just a podcaster. I just have a mic. I'm just a fan with a platform. But I feel like trading away a guy who so desperately wants to be here and play for his hometown team in what would probably be the final year of his career might send a bad message. But at the same time, I understand you're trying to get better. So that is just pure speculation on my point. I could be completely off base. I understand it's a reach, but I think all those factors, I wouldn't mind keeping him around for just the final year of his contract on the third pair. especially because I think given his age and his performance and his 15-team no trade clause and the fact that he wants to be here would make it kind of hard to move him. But again, I'm talking in circles at this point. But again, if they do move him, I'd be like, okay, cool. We can get younger and better. But
yeah, well, I think again, like this is just going to be comparing and contrasting markets for like a lot of the blue line, right? Like if Holl is number one on your list to remove no matter what, okay, then you have a conversation of, is it easier to move? Are you getting a better return for Olli Maatta or Petry? And then what's the difference in talent between those two? Obviously, that's left versus right side as well. You're losing Ghost no matter what. Well, not no matter what. You can re-sign him, but you're probably losing Ghost. Like there's yeah, like at that point, you're kind of just comparing and contrasting the markets for Olli Maatta and Jeff Petry.
I think the
And
market's
those
much
are
better for Maatta, though.
right, for sure. And again, that's also left versus right side as well. So that becomes interesting as far as your roster makeup. But yeah, I think really the and we've said it a billion times, but the blue line is just such a fascinating conversation for this summer because so much could potentially change.
Absolutely. We'll talk Robbie Fabry in segment 3 because I rambled for too long about Petry. That's my bad. And then also talk briefly about the point system because it's not a big conversation. We just want to ask the question. So stay tuned to segment 3 of Lockdown Red Wings. Got to talk to you guys today about Indeed. When you're drafting your fantasy team, do you ever wish you could handpick the best stars for your business team? If you're building your talent roster, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Hate waiting, rather. Indeed's U.S. data shows over 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. Indeed does the hard hiring for you. Sponsor a job, and they'll match you with quality candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your job description right when you post. With Indeed, you can start hiring fast. Join over 3 million businesses worldwide using Indeed to hire great talent fast. Indeed knows when you're growing your own business, you need to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for the quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/lockedon to start hiring now. Just head to Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
Indeed, you do.
Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. We're going to talk about Robbie Fabry real quick. He really, looking at the roster, he's like the only forward I could foreseeably see getting moved, but I'm not sure he does, which is kind of funny. Like, if you think about the way we've structured this episode, I think we've done like most likely, unintentionally done most likely to like least likely getting traded. I think
I have a couple
Justin
other
Holl,
just like really quick shot, like dark horse candidates too after,
you
but they're
do?
not long
Okay.
conversations.
But Justin Holl, obviously number 1. I think Olli Maatta is pretty justifiably number 2, just given his contract situation, is the easiest to move, and it frees up spot on the left side. Jeff Petry, a little bit tougher. It would be fine if they moved him. It actually would be probably better for the team long term if they moved him, but it's tougher just given his age and his contract, and that contract no trade clause. And then now we're talking about Robbie Fabry, a winger who's got one last year left on his contract at $4 million. This past season with the Red Wings, he had 32 points in 68 games, the most games he's played with Detroit in a given season since he got dealt to Detroit from St. Louis, the healthiest he's been all in his entire tenure here. He had 18 goals and 14 assists for 32 points, also the most he's had as a Detroit Red Wing in that time. Scotty, should the Red Wings consider trading Robbie Fabry, and if so, why?
This is entirely down to how many forwards you want to add this summer for me. This is not something you need to do. This is not something the Wings should be going into the summer and be like, we 100% need to move on from Robbie Fabry. Like, again, maybe a Justin Holl conversation where it's, I don't know about 100, but it's like, this is probably not a bad idea. He's not, it's not that level, but this is a 28-year-old $4 million AAV rental player now. He only has 1 year left on his deal. And again, like, you added 11, 12 players, I guess, after DeBrincat. I think it was 11 or 12 players last summer. Like, if you're going to have a huge overhaul like that again which I don't think it'll be that aggressive, but you're going to have an influx of talent. I really do think this just comes down to roster space more than anything else. Because if you are only adding, the holes that you're creating via the players that you're losing in UFA, if those are the only holes that you're filling, then yeah, you can hold on to him and he can be a bottom 6 producing winger and continue his role that he's had the last couple of years. But if you want a big influx, or if you're looking at, bringing in multiple players in one deal, et cetera, then I think that it absolutely is not only a good idea for the team in that case specifically, but I also don't think it would be very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is a guy I have, like, absolutely kind of like the Jeff Petry situation. I don't personally have a problem with keeping him, actually. I also don't have a problem with trading him away. Because he does make $4 million, granted for just one last year, and then it's gone. And that's why I don't mind keeping him. It's one more year on his deal, and he'll be an effective depth piece of the scoring. But he's just not great defensively. And you are paying him $4 million to play third, fourth line minutes, which I guess isn't too bad of an overpay considering, but it's just, you could easily, I feel, move him and then upgrade that position if you wanted to continue to upgrade. I shouldn't say easily upgrade. Because it's hard to get better. It is. But I think you could move him and then try to get better at that same spot. If not get better, make a lateral move for an equally productive player and maybe a cheaper one, to save yourself cap space. Because that's really the bulk of what this conversation is about, is trying to conserve as much cap space as possible with 2 big signings on the horizon. And for a team that's trying to get better, that needs to both balance youth and veterans, you need to create roster space. And like, you'll have roster space regardless to bring up maybe 2 young guys and bring in a couple veterans. But if you want to get better, you could create more roster space and create more cap space by trading away some guys that aren't a part of your long-term future, that only have 1 year left on their deal, and then try and then upgrade at those spots with young guys through trade again or through free agency. And that's what this is about. Like, is Robby Fabbri part of this core? No. Have I loved Robby Fabbri in his time here? Yes, especially in the early parts of the rebuild. Remember Robby Fabbri's hat trick? This guy was like, for 2 years, he was like part of the top 6 when he was healthy, because we didn't have a decision, or we didn't have a choice, rather. And he was great in that role at times. So I loved him at that time, but now as this team's looking to take a step forward, he's slowly moving down the depth chart. And with 1 year left on his deal, I know he's not going to be re-signed. I don't know that, but I'm confident that he's not going to be re-signed. I would be completely happy with moving on. And I think that
again, all about creating roster space really is what his is going to come down to.
Yeah. So with that, I think we can move on real quick. I want to talk about the point system in the NHL.
Hold on.
Oh yeah, your dark horses. I'm sorry.
No. It just like questions more than anything. I mean, Berger. I think that's still. I'm not trying to start a 10-minute conversation, but like, I feel like it's either he's on the opening night starting lineup card or he's traded. Right?
Yeah,
there's
that's
no
fair.
in between anymore.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, and we talked about it after the deadline. We were like, he's probably gone in the offseason. But now that you're looking at what after Yzerman's comments, and you look at the roster, like, there is a spot for him to earn a roster spot come the regular season. But I wouldn't be surprised if he is kind of frustrated with where the organization is at currently. Scotty, let's talk real quick about the point system. We kind of teased it, and sorry, we're not going to spend as much time on it as we wanted, but there's really not that much to say regardless. The Red Wings didn't make the playoffs despite having more wins than the Capitals and the Islanders. The Red Wings had 41 wins, the Capitals had 40, and the Islanders had 39. Yet the Red Wings lost on tiebreaker to the Capital and were 3 points fewer than the New York Islanders. And a disclaimer, I understand that the Red Wings, that I'm not trying to blame the point system. Scotty and I both understand that the Red Wings had their opportunities to make the playoffs and failed to do so at pretty much every given opportunity. Right down the stretch in March and in April, they struggled to get points and struggled to get ahead. But it is definitely frustrating still when you look at how the standings finished and you see the New York Islanders finish 3rd in the Metropolitan Division with 94 points because they lost an NHL leading 16 games in overtime. And I think it was Beer League Chump who mentioned this on social media, on Twitter, who said the NHL doesn't incentivize winning. Instead, they incentivize not losing in regulation. Right. Like, it is kind of crazy that a team that had 2 fewer wins than the Detroit Red Wings finishes the season with 3 more points just simply because they had an NHL leading 16 overtime losses. And the Washington Capitals, who beat you out on a tiebreaker, had 2 extra overtime losses. So it begs the question, does the NHL need to revisit the way they structure their point system? Does it need to go to the college's 3-2-1, where 3 for a regulation win, 2 for an overtime win, and 1 for an overtime loss? Or do we need to get rid of the loser point altogether? Because it is interesting that this is how it keeps the Red Wings are on the outside looking in, despite having more wins than those teams.
Yeah, I think the tiebreaker needs to be reevaluated as well. And again, for the millionth time, I want to make it abundantly clear, like, we're not blaming this for the reason the Wings didn't make the playoffs. They lost every important game in the last 2 weeks of the season and had the worst March I've ever seen. They shot, themselves in the foot. This is their own thing. It is wild to me that the Wings had more more total wins, more wins period than the 2 teams ahead of them or around them in that wild card battle, and found themselves on the outside looking in. I think it's a great way to put it, is that they're not incentivizing the wins, they're incentivizing overtime losses. And I don't know if you get rid of the loser point, maybe you redo, I don't know, maybe regulation wins are worth 3 instead of 2.
I mean, either would
again,
probably...
you could just reevaluate the tiebreaker as well. Like, there's a few different things you could do. It's weird to look and be like, wow, we have more wins than either of these teams, and we're, not the team in there.
Well, and see, here's the thing too, right? Like, they go to 3-2-1. That doesn't necessarily save the Red Wings either, right? Because if they're incentivizing regulation wins more, they're weighting it more at that point, then the Capitals probably would still make the playoffs over the Red Wings, because the Capitals had 32 regulation wins and 27 regulation. Yeah. And the Wings had 27 regulation wins. But that's kind of my point, right? Is that as it stands right now, that's not why the Red Wings got eliminated. That's not why the Capitals made the playoffs. It's because both of those teams, I mean, again, like, I'm not trying to solely blame the point system like you just stated, but it's because those teams had more overtime losses. It's not weighted properly. And this is a conversation that comes up a lot year in and year out with a lot of different teams. So I just wanted to ask the question, like, do the Red Wings need to does NHL need to revisit the point system? Because as it stands right now, they're incentivizing not losing in regulation over winning. Like, right. That's just getting to overtime and getting the point is more valuable than just straight up winning the game in regulation. If they reweight it so that either there is no point for losing in overtime, or they reweight it so that you get the most points by winning in regulation, I think that would be better for the competitive nature of the NHL, because we're kind of seeing it. Now, granted, there's still a lot of playoffs left, and I'm not saying the Red Wings probably would have gotten pumped too by the Rangers, but the Capitals are getting destroyed by New York right now. Yeah. And they don't look like they belong. Again, not saying the Red Wings would have belonged there either, but it's just interesting that it doesn't feel... It felt like a lot of teams just kind of tripped their way into the playoffs and down the stretch.
Well, yeah, that might have more to do with just the...
That's true. There's a lot more going on there.
Yeah, the teams that were involved with the race than anything else, to be honest. That was just a bunch of teams that didn't want it. But no, I agree with the sentiment, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Scotty, with all that being said, got anything else?
I don't think so, man. We ball.
Gotcha. We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow. Probably talk a little about Coach Lalonde. He's here for year 3, and we'll talk about what we need to see out of Coach Lalonde in year 3 to kind of reassure us that he's the guy. So stay tuned for that tomorrow, same time, same place. It's your team every day.
Okay.